Salam and greetings. Welcome to this webinar that's co-hosted by the Afghanistan Program for Peace and Development, AFPAD, at the Kroc Institute for International Peace Studies, and the Peace Research Institute, Oslo, PRIO. My name is Arif Dostiar, and I have the privilege to advise AFPAD and also moderate today's conversation. About 2 weeks ago, the Taliban barred Afghan women from working for the United Nations in Afghanistan. This decision extends the Taliban's directive previously announced in December 2022, banning Afghan women from working for national and international non-governmental organizations. In response, the United Nations Assistance Mission in Afghanistan, UNAMA, protested, stating the UN could not comply with the ban. The Security Council held a meeting behind closed doors, followed by statements calling the Taliban's directive against international laws. How should the UN address this diplomatic standoff? If UNAMA concedes, it's contrary to the UN Charter and UN norms on women and gender. If it reacts by pausing operations, millions of people in need of humanitarian assistance will be impacted. Or is the option not really binary? We have an excellent panel of experts who will analyze the situation and hopefully propose some recommendations. A warm welcome to Mrs. Asila Wardak, former Director General of UN Affairs at Afghanistan's Foreign Ministry, Dr. Urzala Nemat, founder, Development Research Group Limited, Latif Fayaz, former country advisor to NATO's senior civilian representative and UNAMA staff, Sanam Naraghi Anderlani, founder and CEO of the ICANN, and Kaya Borchgrevink, senior researcher at the Peace Research Institute, Oslo, PRIO. Those who wish to share comments or questions may use the Q&A function, and our colleague Ari will collect them. Our panelists are welcome to respond to the main event question, which is, how should the UN respond to the Taliban's prohibition on Afghan women working for the UN? But perhaps each person can look at the question from a slightly different angle so that we can cover as much as possible within the limited time at our disposal. Let us begin with yourself, Mrs. Wardak. Why don't you maybe provide some background, please, to the UN's high-level engagement with the Taliban since December 2022 to prevent this directive from coming. What happened? Why did it not work? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Dostiar, and good morning and salam to everybody. Thank you for giving me the chance to speak on this issue. As you know, and then all our friends know, that UN, not only from December, but after the collapse of Afghanistan, they were very much engaged with Taliban, and also they started very fast their operations in Afghanistan. But the problem is that since December, since the Taliban ban on women and girls that they cannot work, and then they, last year from the education, so there was no action, unfortunately, because UN is also like kind of fed up. January, Amina Mohammed, the DSG of UN, Deputy Secretary General of UN, and also the head of OCHA, Martin Griffiths, they had the trip to Afghanistan, and especially Amina Mohammed, she went herself with head of UN Women to Kandahar to meet the Amir, because there are also a kind of division among the Taliban leadership. Taliban, those that they are sitting in Afghanistan, they're thinking different, and then those that they are sitting in Kandahar, they're the one that sending all these decrees without any consideration or anything else. But unfortunately, Amir didn't meet Amina Mohammed. That was also kind of disappointment. And in Kabul also, instead of talking about humanitarian assistance or any other basic fundamental human rights or employment, women employment, they asked for recognition directly from Amina Mohammed. While everybody knows that the recognition is coming from the countries, from the people, not from the UN directly. But so every delegation that they went to Afghanistan, they are asking for the recognition. And after Amina Mohammed reported to Secretary General, so Secretary General is also decided to have another meeting early May. So maybe next week, in 2 weeks, there will be another meeting of special envoys for Afghanistan from all the world with the Taliban, or maybe with the political office of Taliban in Doha. So they will be discussing and talking about the humanitarian and then women's rights situation in Afghanistan. But unfortunately, as I said, that there is no changes in their behaviors. And now not only UN, but international community is also saying that we will be evaluating Taliban by their deeds and actions, not only by their tweets or fake promises, because there was no changes, anything in the past 2 years, especially after women. Of course, UN also, they have their own policy, and international community also, they have their own gender policy. It's very difficult for UN and international organization also to convene their operation and programs without considering having women as a beneficiaries or as employees and staff working in Afghanistan.
Thank you so much for that background. I'll come back to you, Mrs. Wardak, with more questions throughout the conversation. But you pointed out about the Taliban's demand for recognition. And Dr. Orzala Nemat, would you please maybe share your analysis of what aims do the Taliban really pursue by placing these bans, both in terms of domestic objectives and also foreign policy objectives? And welcome, thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Dostiar. It's a great pleasure to be part of this panel. In terms of Taliban's domestic and foreign policies, what I'd like to share here is our general understanding of who the Taliban are. In general, Taliban are framing themselves to represent the population of Afghanistan as majority by appearance and by religious identity. So they try to frame themselves by the kind of the dress code that they use, the way that they appear, that we are the most sort of true, quote unquote, representative of a traditional society in Afghanistan, which represents the majority of the people. And we are Muslims, and so we are here to establish the Islamic order, as they call it. But in reality, looking deeper into the history of how Taliban emerged as a politico-military group, we all understand that they are there to follow a specific agenda. Now, going deeper into that agenda probably requires another discussion, but here in terms of the current sort of de facto authority, as they are called, their current domestic priority in policies is more laying under strengthening the authority of Kandahar, not only over the entire population in all of the 34 provinces of Afghanistan, but also over Kabul. Kabul represents or characterizes the government system of Taliban, meaning the executive part of the Taliban, the ministries, the sort of the directorate positions and the ministerial positions of different institutions, public institutions, are all based in Kabul. And Kandahar, where their so-called supreme leader is established and based, is mainly trying to monopolize the entire decision-making politically, socially, economically, and also in terms of military and control over violence in general, as you see. One example of that is the creation of the Ulama, so-called Ulama Council or Shurai Ulama or Ulama Council in each of the 34 provinces that is directly reporting to the supreme leader rather than reporting to Kabul. So that's very important for our understanding in terms of knowing the Taliban's existing domestic policies. their pressure towards women is coming specifically from the fact that women are remaining the only visible resisting force against the Taliban rules. And because the women become very articulate in their demands to access jobs, to access education, the systematic restriction against women is linked to that directly. And the UN ban 2 weeks ago is an example of that, is one of the examples of that. We know that there are many other examples before that, and probably there will be more as we move on. In terms of foreign policy, it's important to highlight 2 points here. Taliban's foreign ambition in terms of foreign policy is to have public recognition, as Ms. Wardak also explained. They want to be recognized by the entire world as a sort of quote-unquote legitimate state. And for that, they are building some relationship. And for that, the Taliban narrative is that we don't know what is wrong with the world not recognizing us. Whereas, I mean, world has standards. Each country, starting with the countries that are closest to the Taliban, that are probably directly or indirectly playing an important role with the Taliban, even they cannot recognize the regime and the way that it operates at the moment. So it is really like that contradictory sort of situation where they don't get a full recognition from the world, but that's their ambition. They also specifically and economically are interested in delisting their members from the sanctions list, the UN terrorist sanction list. And that is also not reaching anywhere because they don't make any specific steps or progress towards that. And if I just sort of take a minute to go further on how UN should respond, very briefly, my sort of like top recommendations on that would be that UN definitely needs to have a coherent response. We know that there is some differences between the political side of the UN versus the humanitarian side, but there needs to be an absolute coherence in the terms of the positioning of the UN, as well as the international aid agencies involved in Afghanistan and international donors in Afghanistan. There shouldn't be flexibilities when it comes to the principled position. They should be principled in the way that they are loyal or they are sort of like responsible to implement or to not contradict the UN Charter, which is something that each member state have to follow. And then they need to address the issues of emergency humanitarian crisis that is in Afghanistan. So while being principled, it doesn't mean that they have to pack out and leave the country, but making sure that whatever aid is receiving to the neediest and most vulnerable people in the country is going directly to the individuals and not to the Taliban in any way or form. That will sort of determine. And finally, on standing strong on the sanctions against the individual Taliban members as they are, because any flexibility on the sanctions is going to jeopardize again and accept the sort of normalization of the situation as say. The argument that the Taliban are making that these are our internal and domestic affairs is not justifiable in any way or form, neither for the United Nations nor for any of the countries engaged in Afghanistan, because we talk about 40 million population and Taliban may represent not even a percentage of that. It's a number of people who are taken the country as a result of a deal, a political deal by the international actors and regional actors involved in the country. So these are generally the points that I wanted to make in terms of the UN response to this latest development. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Dr. Nebat. Those are all really important points, and maybe we can talk later about more about the foreign policy aspects that you shared, particularly also relating to the region, as you pointed out. But let me, for now, invite Mr. Latif Fayaz to take and expand on what actually you mentioned, Dr. Nebat, on that there are these internal rivalries, basically, is what I hear you saying, over power and control and fear of resistance by women. And that's one reason that's probably, you are saying, pushing the Taliban to place these bans. Mr. Fayaz, can you please share your analysis on how the UN could really deal with this dilemma of either following its own principles and abiding within the charter or conceding to the Taliban. I appreciate any insight you could share with us on that.
Thank you, Mr. Dostior, and thanks for the host organization to provide me this opportunity to speak about a very critical and important topics. You know that when I'm talking today about the UN and the situation that UN and the people of Afghanistan are experiencing and facing in these days, it reminds me that the days that I was working as a UN staff, the UN had not a smooth mission in the past 2 decades in Afghanistan. I remember the day that angry protesters attacked the UN compound in Mazar-e-Sharif and killed more than 7 people in that protest. It was a challenge for the United Nations at that time. But the current challenge that the United Nations mission in Afghanistan are facing is totally different with the challenge that the UN had in the past. Because this challenge or an issue of values and principles that United Nations has been created upon and built upon these values. Like the issue of working of women and also the women public participation. These are some things that are elaborated very well in the United Nations Charter and also in the United Nations Covenant on the political and civil rights, and also on the United Nations Covenant on the economic, cultural, and social rights, and also in the other UN document. So first of all, what it is important for the United Nations is to make sure that Taliban understand that this banning or barring women from working with the United Nations is not just a case of women work. It is a case of UN principle and UN values. And United Nations could not compromise, and United Nations could not negotiate on the subjects of values and principles, because if the United Nations compromise and comply with the Taliban directive regarding banning women from working with the United Nations, it has 2 very critical and consequences for the United Nations. First of all, it is the issue of principle and values that Taliban will dictate the value of a group that is exactly right now in the banned list of the United Nations and the top Taliban leadership on the blacklist of the United Nations. So if the Taliban dictate its values, it means that United Nations conceding and ignoring its values and principles to the values of a group that is in the blacklist of the United Nations and has no internal and external legitimacy. So that is one thing which is very important, that the Taliban, the United Nations has to make sure that Taliban understand it. And the second issue is that this directive is a direct interference to the internal affairs of the United Nations. While United Nations Charter says that it is an independent organization, no country has to interfere, has a right to interfere to the United Nations internal affairs. When a government or a group ask the United Nations that who they should be recruited, who they should not. This is a direct interference, and which is not acceptable for the United Nations. So it is a real dilemma for the United Nations, but what the UN can do and to proceed and to with the Taliban, I think still United Nations has some option, although the options are not maybe not good options, but still United Nations can have diplomatic options and also some sanctions. First of all, I think what is important, as Mrs. Nemad mentioned, to send a strong and unified message to the Taliban leadership that the issues of UN principles and values are not negotiable, and it's not an issue of compromise. First of all, it is very important because unfortunately the United Nations has not sent such a strong message to the Taliban yet, because I heard even the Deputy Secretary General Representative avoiding to use the word of the term of pressure on the Taliban, and they said that we are going to negotiate. You say, so this is very important to send a strong message to the Taliban that we are not going to negotiate on our principle and values. And the second issue that the United Nations can do is the model of the negotiation and diplomatic efforts that the United Nations did regarding this treaty between Russia and Ukraine through the Turkey facilitation. It was a high-level delegation, a high-level engagement of the United Nations. The UN can do the same model with the engagement of the Secretary General with the neighboring countries, with Islamic countries in the Afghanistan neighbors and regional countries, in order to send a unified and strong message to the Taliban. And the third options that the UN has is that distinguish between the political aspects and humanitarian aspect. United Nations has a huge presence in Afghanistan. There are a lot of United Nations organizations in Afghanistan that all of them are not in the humanitarian mission. There are political missions, there are development organizations like UNDP, like UNAMA is a political mission, So it should be distinguished between the political and development programs and the humanitarian program. While the United Nations can continue it is humanitarian aid to the people who needs this life-saving assistance delivery, but can reconsider its position regarding the cash boxes that the United Nations is facilitating to Afghanistan. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Those are there are so many important points you mentioned, and I would love to pick up on some of them. And particularly, I would like to come back to you on your recommendation on sending a strong message that UN principles cannot be changed because of the Taliban and cannot be compromised. And I think you mentioned the mechanism of engaging the region and Islamic countries, but I would like to ask later, if I'll come back to you and ask, really, how can that message be communicated? In what language? And what means could be used? So thank you. But let me invite Sanam Naraghi Anderlani for now. And picking up on some of the things that Mr. Fayaz shared, maybe would you please share a little about the impact of all of this conversation on the human rights situation, and maybe, if time allows, on the humanitarian situation as well. Thank you, Sanam, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much. I just wanted to step back a little bit and pick up on where Mr. Fayaz and Ms. Wardak were talking about, just to just to put this in a both in the human rights context, but also in terms of what the implications are. So number one, the fact that we're now saying we want to see deeds and not words is kind of late in the game. This should have been done back in 2014, back in 2015, 16, all the way to the run-up of the withdrawal in Doha. It should have been at the diplomatic tables, because that's when the international community had leverage. And instead, what they did was the Taliban would bomb a maternity hospital and they continued to negotiate. And the Taliban would kill more civilians and they continued to negotiate. So this problem that we're seeing now, and the if you want, the behavior of the Taliban vis-a-vis the world, is something that we enabled back at the negotiation table, and it needs to be rolled back. We need to put a stop to it. So that's one thing. The second thing is this argument about, oh, we are a traditional society, this is Muslim values, these are our traditional cultural values, etc. That also needs to be questioned. There is nothing in Islam that says women can't work. In fact, we all know Khadija worked. We all know the Quran talks about it's the duty of every Muslim to be educated. So framing this in terms of Islamic values is an insult to Muslims and to Islam generally. And that is something that needs to be addressed. And I think that needs to be addressed by Muslim countries. They need to step up to the plate, because this reflects terribly on billions of people around the world. And to frame Islam in this way is, as far as I'm concerned, it's worse than apostasy if you're a true believer. So that's thing. And related to that, which comes back to the points that were made before, is if the Taliban says, oh, we are a principled entity and we stand by our traditional values and our traditional culture, you need to, recognize that. The international system needs to talk to them in exactly the same way. We stand by our principles. We have key principles on human rights, on valuing life, on valuing women and children and so forth, and making sure that they're fed and clothed and get to school. And we have something called the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Has anyone even shared that with them? Has there been any discussion of going through point by point what it means to be recognized by the UN system? If you want to be a member of this institution, you have to abide by these values. Has anyone shared those values with them? And really framing it in the same way that they're trying to push back with us. As far as traditional culture, I'm an anthropologist. I've worked for 25 years around the world. I don't know any traditional culture or leadership that will hold its own constituency hostage and create desperation in its own constituency for its political gain. So again, I think that there's a deep hypocrisy here, and these things need to be addressed with those who talk to them. Then we come to the issue of what's happening. As our colleague said, what's happening in Afghanistan does not stay in Afghanistan. It hasn't stayed in Afghanistan. The Taliban's takeover and how they used patience and force to push out the international community and get what they wanted is already being learnt and exercised by extremist groups everywhere, in other places by Islamic militants in other countries. If we don't stand together based on our core values internationally and universally, what happens to Afghans and what's happening in Afghanistan is going to spread elsewhere, and the entire UN system may as well pack up and go home. So what's at risk is profound. I don't know whether our international leadership sees that. To me, what seems to have happened is that they pulled out of Afghanistan. They want to lock the door and go away and maybe throw a few scraps of food and humanitarian aid. That is not the answer, which brings me to my next point. We need a political solution. We can't be talking about, oh, we're going to give humanitarian aid there. We're going to negotiate, first Afghan women speak, getting to work or not. Then it's UN women. Then it's UN who work for the women. This is a game that they are playing. It's a very, very dangerous game. And what we need to be doing is, as Mr. Fayez said, there needs to be high-level engagement. It needs to be at the regional and global level. China needs to be sitting at the table. If China wants to be a big player in the international diplomacy, mediation, helping solve the world's problems, because the US and the Western world has failed so far, they need to address these things. There needs to be that level of engagement and looking at it. Iran has to be there. Pakistan has to be there. There needs to be a strategy and a vision about how we're going to, if and how we're going to engage. What are the red lines? And the politics and the humanitarian affairs, I think, at that level need to come together, because you can't just do humanitarian without addressing the politics, and you can't ignore the politics anymore. So that needs to be brought together. And Afghan women need to be in those spaces fully, not at a sideshow, not in a side circus, not as a paper that they present that maybe gets taken, but as delegations at the table. And I'll end with this. You asked about the humanitarian and human rights situation overall. We all know it's dire. We know, there's nothing more to say. It is horrific what's going on. The fact that children are missing school, girls and boys, in fact, but the fact that so many girls are being, their lives are being thwarted every single day. This is not acceptable. But what we must recognize is that it has been Afghan women and girls who warned us throughout these years and have stood on the streets of Kabul and on the streets of every other city in your country, pushing back, looking into the barrel of the gun. And what I would say here, if there's one thing that I would like to see, is where are the men and boys? How many Talib are there in Afghanistan compared to the majority of the population? Where is the rest of your society in terms of standing, I would say probably behind the women in these protests, but there needs to be more demand from the ground up. It's the courage that Afghan women have shown cannot be underestimated. It needs to be celebrated. It needs to be celebrated by every Afghan citizen inside and outside the country. They are holding things together for the future. And by the way, they're also doing it for the rest of us internationally. And so that recognition is also really, really critical. What it is that they're doing is relevant for the rest of us in terms of what the UN represents to us globally going forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Sanam. Those are so many important, profound points. And on the issue of also showing deeds to women and including them and allowing them to the space to lead the way. And perhaps in the UN General Assembly that's in September, a woman should be invited, where normally heads of states are invited. This year, maybe the UN should invite a woman from Afghanistan, and a slot on day one should be given to them so that they can share what it is that they would like the world to hear, so that the world really hears the realities of our country. And a lot of people touched on the issue of the region and Islamic countries. Let me invite you back, Mrs. Wardak, and also here, Ambassador Vigadas Yusakas, thank you so much for joining, has also asked this question of basically which regional players could the UN engage in talking to different Taliban leaders? And I would like to add really who are the UN's partners on this particular issue in the region and also among the Islamic countries. I know Uzbekistan a few months ago had proposed a mechanism of high-level engagement composed of both globally and regionally. What is the latest on that, if you have tracked that? But in general, who are the UN's partners in the region that could be engaged?
Thank you. As you said that, yes, there are so many partners, individual and also as a group. For instance, Uzbekistan, Turkey, Iran, Pakistan, they are in direct talks with Taliban. And also as a group, OIC is very much involved. They have the special envoy also for Afghanistan, that they are observing the humanitarian assistance and also human rights situation in Afghanistan. And also Malaysia, they were very much, Malaysia is not immediate neighbor, but as an Islamic country and as a member of the OIC, so they were very much involved in terms of helping and supporting the curriculum. They said that the education curriculum And also Indonesia, they are involved in direct negotiation with Taliban. Of course, Qatar is also one of the countries that since beginning of the Doha agreement, they were involved in, then they gave the space to Taliban, and still they have the political office. And Qatar also hosted, and then will host the special envoy meeting early this May month in Doha. So these are the countries that directly they are involved with de facto authorities.
Thank you so much. Dr. Saib Nehmat, what is OIC? What is OIC's role in all of this? As Ms. Wardak mentioned, I know they have been traveling back and forth to Kabul almost regularly, the Organization of Islamic Cooperation. Could you comment on whether the UN could partner with them and what kind of role they might be able to play?
Thank you, Dostiar Saib. Just before that, I wanted to just quickly also comment on the one point regarding the international actors in different countries, region or beyond, role in Afghanistan in terms of their engagement. UN is representative of the member states, and China, Turkey, United Arab Emirates, Iran, all are member states of the United Nations, aren't they? And what we find quite ironic is that in spite of Taliban's restrictive rules towards women, specifically since the time of their arrival back into power in August 21, each of these countries, one after the other, are recognizing their ambassadors as if, quietly providing the Taliban representatives in their embassies in their countries. I know for consulate affairs, every embassy is trying their best to be active one way or another. But the point is that why, for example, a pen holder to the United Nations Security Council, United Arab Emirates, allowed a Taliban, under what condition have they allowed the Taliban members to come to and occupy the United Arab Afghan embassy? That's something to be pointed out. So when we say coherent action, it means between the political, humanitarian, and all diplomatic, there has to be coherence. Because Taliban are exploitive, as Ms. Naragi was saying, they're exploitive, and they learned that this exploitation worked fantastically in their interest. So that's one thing. When it comes to the Organization of Islamic Countries, OIC, historically speaking, has been quite influenced by one of our neighboring countries who have had a very close ties with the Taliban, and namely Pakistan, if I may say. So that goes back to that in the post-August context, because of the fact that the Taliban are framed, as I said in my earlier remarks, as the representatives of an Islamic order, the representative of the Islamic government that they are supposed to create. That's created a lot of reputational issues for all of the Muslim countries and in their relations with the non-Muslim countries as well. So within the countries in Islamic context, but also beyond that. And one of the attempts of the OIC members and their delegations trying to come and sort of negotiate with the Taliban is this fact that at least, okay, there are some aspect of your ruling that is it's internal affairs. We will not interfere. That's fine. But, basically denying the fundamental rights of half of your population is un-Islamic. And that has been systematically, communicated by OIC members which is good. So how UN can basically use OIC? First of all, Taliban's response to OIC is not different from the Taliban's response to the UN. We have to be very careful with this. So I wouldn't argue for UN with such large leverage that the United Nations has from different aspects to shrink its relationship with the Taliban by only channeling every relations towards the OIC, which is not also recognized by the Taliban in the same way. They receive their members, but only use that for publicity and showing that how a certain member of the delegation kissed the hand of the Minister of Interior, for example. This is not effective. What is more effective is for the United Nations, for the political side of the different partner countries or member states, to come with one response. And that is to show that there is a fundamental principle to be member of the world or the global society. And that is to have a fundamental respect to the rights of women and men in the same way. And Taliban has to be punished. In the last 2 years that the Taliban take power, we have seen almost no or little kind of ways that the Taliban are pressurized. Any pressure towards Afghanistan, including the banking crisis and the sanction, is suffered by the people, by the population. Taliban have open hands in a revenue collection. They have open hands in terms of trading Afghanistan's military equipments and everything in the neighboring countries. They have open hands in the drug trafficking that is happening. And there hasn't been any ways to pressurize them other than them certain members being on the terrorist list, which mentioned before. I saw there was a question on the chat. Do you want me to address that, or should we come to that later, Dusiar Saib?
Please go ahead. Yes, I saw that.
Yes. So with regards to this question, partly I probably covered it by saying that there are ironies when it comes to the international actors' relations towards Afghanistan, because
if we could share the questions so everybody knows, are you referring to the question that how aid could get into Afghanistan but not fall in the hands of the Taliban?
Yes, precisely. Mr. Khisrao Majidi has asked this question. So my response is this. So far, including myself, formerly leading Afghanistan Research and Evaluation Unit, we treated the Taliban as the de facto authorities, as we call them. So they occupy the state positions. So we treated them as the state representative in some ways, being, directly responsible for reporting to the Taliban, to the Ministry of Economy's NGO Directorate and so forth. So we've maintained, the entire aid community maintained their relationship with the state institutions the same way as the Republic time in terms of accountability, transparency, and ensuring that they are informed about that. So when we treat them in that way and it doesn't work, what I foresee happening in the future is that we go back to the mode of the late 90s, where myself and many other women that I am familiar with were running underground activities. So we will have no choice but to continue our work for educating girls, for helping women in terms of health, nutrition, and many other aspects of the work through underground means, which means going off the sort of radars of the state, which is not also the ideal way to deal with this, because increasingly with very fundamental and basic projects, from what I'm hearing from women organizations operating in Afghanistan, they face barriers after barriers after barriers. Even working from home, which is a mod currently for most of the working women in the NGO community, they are being pressurized or threatened that they should not even continue working from home, as it is forbidden by the decree that is issued. So when I'm saying we need a unified framework, an institutional framework, it's up to the UN to create such a framework within the country in terms of finding a way that the aid reaches the people directly and reduces to the minimum level the engagement of the Taliban authorities. Like the whole of the reporting mechanism, Mr. Fayaz was talking about, how this whole decree is an interference in an independent international organization such as UN. So, moving to that side probably will be a way forward, because an alternative that I see is going to sort of evolve as a result of all these systematic discrimination and bans and so forth is going to the underground sort of mod, and that will create a lot of other troubles, because then there will be question of transparency, accountability, who gets the funding, how it is spent, what are the objectives, who is operating there, who brings money for what purpose in the country. So there will be a lot of chaos as a result of that. Because what is an important fact, and I reiterate the points made earlier by another speaker, is that the Afghan woman by nature are not the type of people who will surrender to these kind of rules or restrictions by regimes. History has shown that in the past and in prison, we the people of Afghanistan in general, but particularly the women, will find ways to remain active, committed to our values, to our identity, to our national sort of interests in the country, and to our obligation, Islamic obligation of educating ourselves, finding dignified ways of working and being beneficial to the society. So there will not be any way or form to sort of like jeopardize that. But then it's up to the international community to find creative ways of supporting us as Afghan women in general, and also up to the Taliban to figure out that bans are not really effective and useful, and it will just turn them into a joke of really continuing these kind of restrictions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Saeb Nemat. I would like to invite Mr. Fayaz back. One of the viewers have said that the UN has multiple principles and not just one principle. And one principle is at least do no harm. And so whether it takes action or if it doesn't take action, for example, if it leaves, it could also hurt people. How can the UN reconcile its principles in a situation like this?
You know that right now, Taliban use this humanitarian requirement and needs of the people of Afghanistan as the weakness point for the international community and for the UN organization in Afghanistan. And using it as an instrument that, okay, if you stop delivering this humanitarian aids, so the people will suffer. That's true. But it's very important to understand that United Nations international community can change this weakness point to it is strongness point. You know, that's very important, because you know that the cash boxes that has been delivered through UN to the to Afghanistan, it is helping directly or indirectly the Taliban and the institution in Afghanistan. It is supporting the economic system of Afghanistan. If the economic system of Afghanistan collapses, then it is not only the people of Afghanistan who suffers. It is the Taliban also suffering from this point. You know, this is the very important point that the United Nations international community needs to make sure Taliban understand this, that if the international aids and this cash box is stopped, because of the Taliban directive to bar women from working with the United Nations and in the international non-governmental organization. So it is not only the Afghan people suffering, it is Taliban that their power will be weakened, and the institutions will be weakened, because if the money is not injected through the economic system of Afghanistan, in this case the Taliban will not be able to deliver service to the people, and if the people do not get the service, so the people will be disobedient. The people will regard the Taliban as a group that take them as a hostage. You know, in this case, it is not just one way. It is an issue of two way. It is the issue that United Nations can use it as a strong diplomatic means in order to make the Taliban understand that it is not only for the benefit of Afghan people, it is for their benefit also.
Thank you. And I wanted to ask that you don't think the Taliban know that already? And I've just asked that question from Sanam. I see that we're short on time, so I'll just shift that question to you, Sanam. Do the Taliban not know that their actions are also going to hurt just everybody? Because we're trying to also establish what is it that they really want. Do they want, for example, the United Nations to just go home, to just pack and leave? Another thing, if you could cover, is you shared about a political solution. And if you could maybe expand on that comment as well. Thank you.
What does the Taliban want? I think we have to look at their actions. And they want power. They want to have a place in the world, and they want to have it in their way. And as much as we have lots of problems around the world, that many countries are short of implementing or living by the principles of the UDHR and the principles of the UN. But and this is actually one of the problems, that when you set standards and then you flout them, or you set rules and principles and you flout them, you're signaling to everybody else that they can also chip away at these. But there comes a point where we have to put a stop to it. And again, if we give in now, the implications, not only for Afghanistan, Afghan women and children and the population at large, not only it's bad for them, it's bad for people in other countries where we have extremist movements watching and seeing what the tactics are. So the fact that the Taliban up to now has in a way been enabled by, whether it's by Pakistan, whether it's by Qatar, whether it's by the American diplomacy, whatever these things are, these are all a collection of mistakes and mistaken strategies and tactics that have led us to where we are. And someone's got to put a stop to it. And so this is the moment. And Qatar, UAE, somebody asked in the chat, why would you bring Iran? You need the people that are a part of the problem, but to be part of the solution. Iran is hosting, whether it wants it or not, and whether Afghans like it or not, but Iran is hosting millions of Afghan refugees right now, right? And so they need to be sitting at the table and also held accountable, because what we're seeing in the Iranian context is the poisoning of girls' schools. So some of the tactics of the Taliban is now being transferred into the hands of the Iranian state. So, we need transparency. We need to shine the spotlight both on the regional states, on the enablers that are there, and hold every single one accountable. As Ursula was mentioning, you can't have UAE being in the Security Council on the one hand and making some bland statement and then opening an embassy. That we need to shine the spotlight and hold people accountable and stop the hypocrisy that is going on. It's going to take time. It's going to take energy and resources and radical diplomacy and engagement. But I don't see any other way of going ahead than this, in a way, because we've had a year and a half of this haphazard, we'll have a little bit of humanitarian, let's see. And so it's not working. It's just not working. The question of, do no harm versus our rights. I think these things go together at some point. If the Taliban cared about the Afghan population, they would be feeding them. They would be bending over backwards right now to make sure that people had food and could, go to whatever, get healthcare and get all the benefits of the international community. So assuming that the Taliban cares about the constituency is a false premise. They don't. They're expecting us, the international community, to care more than they do. And the international community, the only way we can do this is if we have coherence in how we're envisioning the political situation, getting everybody online, and then engaging them and holding, as I say, holding them accountable and putting the mirror to their hypocrisy and to the nonsense that they have been peddling around the world under the guise of tradition, culture, religion, etc.
Thank you so much for those comments, Sanam. And I wish we were able to continue this conversation much longer, but we have to end it for now. And so I would like to invite Kaya to please deliver her concluding remarks and, if possible, share some of the key points from today's conversation with us. Kaya, up to you.
Good morning and greetings from Oslo. Thank you for inviting me to take part in this really urgent and important panel. It's been a really rich discussion with so many different points being brought up. I think that's what has, there are I think some of them really important observations comes from this, how this situation is presenting entirely new challenges to the UN, like Latif Fayaz was talking about how, really getting to the core of the values and the principles. On the other side, I think this how to address this in concretely. There are so many different aspects to bring up. Because what I'm left with is kind of this question that was recently addressed by Sanam about what is it that the Taliban really wants, and I'm not sure if it's if they want one thing or and we see, different parts of the Taliban leadership taking different stands on these issues. But how can they, sorry, I should get back to the main question, and how should the UN respond? I think that as has been brought up by many of the speakers today, it's this really the call for a concerted and common approach by the international community, and how the international community need to work together. And as has been mentioned, including actors that are not maybe the main promoters of human rights and women's rights, like China and Iran, and the countries in the neighborhood is needed in order to get a broad political solution. I also think that bringing in Muslim actors, like was mentioned about the OIC and Indonesia, Malaysia, is one strategy, although also the leverage of the OIC is maybe not great, and that it was pointed out that it should not be the only channel for the UN, or that it shouldn't limit its channels. Well, I think that there's clearly no easy answer to this, and it's a very challenging situation for the UN, and Afghanistan is kind of again at the center of geopolitics, with China with its interests and all the other neighboring countries. It's I think it's just really important to take this broad and inclusive approach, and of course to make Afghan women sit at the table. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kaya. Absolutely. Very difficult question, very difficult challenge, and lots of important issues that were raised about why the Taliban are doing this for ideological reasons, rivalries over power, using this as a bargaining chip, and also a wide range of other reasons. Probably even competition with other extremist groups that I would like to add. And the major recommendation here is that we need to, the world needs to take a united and coherent stance. And this conversation cannot be concluded really, so we will continue this, even though we will have to end this call for today. Thank you so much, distinguished panelists. And I also want to thank Priyu for the partnership, Dr. Christian Harpviken, if I said that name accurately, and also my colleagues here at the University of Notre Dame, Communications Department, Kate Chester, Lisa Gallagher, Ari Woodward, and also Lori Nathan, the director of the mediation program, who has been a big support. Thank you to all of you, and have a great rest of your day.